You are not here by accident. Something within you, something quieter than logic, older than any choice you have consciously made, guided you to this precise moment. And before this experience concludes, you will begin to understand exactly why. Perhaps lately you have been carrying something you cannot fully name. Not the ordinary weight of a difficult week, something deeper. A steady, persistent sense that no matter how much effort you put into holding yourself together, the world keeps discovering new ways to pull you apart. A single message arrives at the wrong moment. A single glance from someone you trust lands differently than intended. A single comment in a room full of people cuts through everything you built that morning. And suddenly the entire structure of your day shifts, not gradually, not gently, but instantly. Your chest tightens, your thoughts begin to race, your mood changes from something stable into something fragile. And you find yourself wondering how something so seemingly small could cost so much internal energy. Most people accept that as simply how life operates. They treat emotional instability as an unavoidable tax on being human. But that is not the full truth. The complete truth is that most people have never been genuinely taught the difference between feeling an emotion and being controlled by that emotion. And that single distinction, that one precise line, changes the entire experience of living. You are here because something within you already senses that. You are here because you have witnessed other people remain grounded in circumstances that would have completely unraveled you. You are here because you are ready to stop existing at the mercy of whatever happens around you and to start living from something constructed within you that cannot be so easily moved. Today, through this audiobook brought to you by Elite Success Audiobooks, you are going to discover exactly how to build that. If you become emotional every time life applies pressure, life controls you. And life will apply pressure. It will test your patience during the longest commutes, the most inconvenient delays, the smallest frustrations that arrive without warning. It will test your pride in conversations where you are misrepresented. It will test your confidence in moments of unexpected silence. It will test your strength precisely when circumstances refuse to unfold according to your plan. A single notification on your phone, a single shift in someone's tone, a single unexpected change to something you were counting on. And your mood shifts. Your thoughts spiral inward. Your entire internal world reorganizes itself around something external, something that may not even deserve that level of influence over you. That is how subtle the loss of control actually is. That is how quietly and efficiently your power slips away from you when you are not paying attention to the gap between what happens and what you allow to happen inside you. Most people believe that genuine strength means reacting quickly, speaking up without delay, defending yourself without hesitation, proving your point, claiming the moment before someone else does. But real strength is far quieter than that description. Real strength is what happens when you feel everything, all of it, fully and completely, and still choose not to be governed by what you feel. Being unbothered does not mean you do not care. It does not mean you are cold or detached from the people and experiences around you. It does not mean you are passive or emotionally unavailable. It means your inner state is no longer subject to the constant negotiation of external circumstances. That is power in its most developed form. Because here is a truth that does not change regardless of how much time passes or how much the world shifts around you. Life will not stop testing you. People will misread your intentions. Plans you have carefully constructed will dissolve without warning. Someone will treat you with less respect than you have earned. Something will not unfold the way you prepared for it to unfold. The question was never whether those tests would arrive. The question has always been whether you will remain centered when they do. In this audiobook, we are not going to offer you techniques for avoiding pressure. We are not going to make promises about a life without conflict or difficulty. And we are not going to encourage you to push your emotions down and pretend they are not present. Instead, we are going to train something that carries far more long-term value than any of those approaches. We are going to train your response, not your reaction, your response. Because those two things are entirely different. And understanding that difference is where this entire journey begins. Over the course of this experience, you will learn how to create a genuine space between the stimulus you encounter and the reaction your nervous system wants to produce. You will learn how to stop internalizing things that were never actually about you. You will learn how to detach emotionally without disconnecting from the people and situations that genuinely matter. You will learn how to protect your energy the way that effective, grounded leaders protect theirs. And you will learn how to become the steadiest, most composed presence in the room, particularly when the room itself is in chaos. This is not about becoming numb. It is about becoming stable. That distinction carries enormous weight. Numbness shuts down feeling entirely. It is a defense mechanism that isolates you from your own experience. Stability is something entirely different. Stability holds feeling without losing direction. It acknowledges what is present without being governed by it. It is the foundation that every genuinely powerful, grounded, consistent person has spent time deliberately constructing. Most people exist in a near constant state of reaction. Their mood shifts with every notification. Their confidence rises and falls with every opinion. Their peace is determined by whether the last thing that happened to them was favorable or unfavorable. If someone praises them, they rise. If someone criticizes them, they collapse inward. If something resolves, they relax. If something goes sideways, they panic. Their entire emotional state is continuously negotiated by the outside world. And that negotiation is exhausting in ways that accumulate slowly and damage deeply. When you learn to stay unbothered, something fundamental changes in how you move through your days. You stop pursuing external validation as though your sense of self depends on receiving it. You stop over-explaining your choices to people who have no genuine authority over your direction. You stop defending your boundaries to people who never truly respected them. You stop engaging in debates designed not to seek truth, but to protect ego. And in doing all of that, you begin to conserve something precious, your energy. You begin to respond rather than react. You begin to observe rather than absorb. And that is precisely when your clarity expands. Because when you are no longer flooded by the constant noise of emotional reactivity, you can actually think. You can actually evaluate. You can actually choose your next move with intention rather than selecting it impulsively from a state of surge. Staying unbothered is not about winning arguments. It is about reclaiming ownership of your own mind. It is about recognizing, clearly and consistently, that not everything deserves your full attention. Not every comment requires your explanation. Not every situation earns your emotional investment. Some things deserve your silence. Some moments deserve your deliberate pause. And some people, frankly, deserve your respectful distance. You will still feel anger. You will still experience disappointment. Frustration will still surface in your body and your mind. You are human, and those are human responses. But you will no longer allow those feelings to determine your behavior. That is the precise line between maturity and impulse, between leadership and chaos, between a life that feels directed and a life that feels constantly interrupted. Throughout this journey, each principle will directly challenge a common emotional habit that keeps you reactive, that keeps you spending energy you cannot afford to lose on situations that do not deserve that level of investment. We will examine the need to be understood by others, the urge to defend yourself in every moment, the attachment to closure that someone else has to provide, the discomfort that silence creates, the anxiety that lives inside the fear of being judged. And one by one, with precision rather than hype, we will dismantle those habits, through awareness, through discipline, through practice that is consistent enough to become identity. Because calm is not a personality trait. Some people are not simply born composed, while others are born reactive. Calm is a trained response. It is the product of repeated, deliberate choice made in moments that demanded a different kind of discipline. And when you train that response long enough, something extraordinary and quiet begins to happen. You walk into a room, and you are not scanning the faces around you for signals of approval or disapproval. You hear criticism directed at you, and you do not become instantly defensive. You face genuine uncertainty, and you do not mentally spiral into collapse. You remain steady in a way that other people begin to notice and unconsciously respect. That steadiness becomes your edge. In a loud world saturated with noise and reactivity, the calm person becomes visible in an entirely different way. In emotional chaos, the grounded person naturally leads, not because they demand authority, but because they demonstrate stability that others find themselves gravitating toward. In moments of genuine tension, the unbothered person sees with clarity that reactive people simply cannot access. That can be your experience. But only if you choose to build it. Only if you decide that what happens inside you holds more value and deserves more protection than what is happening around you. Now, let us move into the first principle, the one that underlies everything else that follows, and the one that most people will recognize immediately because they live inside its effects every single day without fully realizing it. Someone does not reply to your message. Your mind immediately begins to construct a narrative. They are ignoring me. They have lost respect for me. I said something that pushed them away. I should not have sent that last one. And just like that, a simple delay, a silence that has dozens of possible explanations, becomes a story. That story generates emotion. That emotion generates a reaction. This is where the vast majority of emotional instability originates. Not in what actually happened, in the meaning that you decided to attach to what happened. Taking things personally feels entirely automatic. It feels natural because it is deeply conditioned. The human brain is wired to interpret events in relation to the self. It continuously and often unconsciously asks, "What does this mean about me? Where do I stand? Is this a threat?" But beneath that automatic interpretation lies a deeper truth that most emotionally reactive people never fully internalize. Most of what other people say and do has very little to do with you. Most of the time, their behavior has everything to do with their current emotional state, their stress, their exhaustion, their insecurities, their unresolved history, their personal struggles that you may have no visibility into at all. Yet, when you personalize their behavior, you absorb their internal chaos into your internal world. And that is the beginning of losing control. Quietly, invisibly, repeatedly. Consider this scenario. Two colleagues receive identical critical feedback from the same supervisor on the same morning. The first thinks, "She believes I am incompetent. She is questioning my judgment." The second thinks, "She is operating under significant pressure right now. Let me extract what is genuinely useful from this feedback and apply it." Same words, delivered by the same person in the same tone. Different interpretation constructed by the listener. Entirely different emotional outcome. The first person spends the remainder of their day and much of the evening mentally replaying the interaction, rehearsing responses, feeling diminished. The second adjusts what can be adjusted, improves what can be improved, and moves forward without carrying unnecessary weight. The difference was not intelligence. It was not resilience as a fixed trait. It was emotional distance, the practiced ability to separate what someone said from what it means about you as a person. When you take everything personally, you surrender control of your internal state to the external world. A passing comment can redirect your entire mood. A minor misunderstanding can consume hours of your mental bandwidth. A stranger's opinion can activate doubt about things you had previously felt certain about. And life becomes an exhausting series of emotional negotiations that you never chose to enter, but somehow keep finding yourself in. But when you stop personalizing every interaction and every silence and every shift in energy, something shifts in your favor. You begin to observe rather than absorb. You start recognizing with clarity that someone's short tone reflects their current emotional state, not your worth as a person. Someone's disagreement reflects their perspective, and their experiences, not a rejection of your value. Someone's silence reflects their priorities in that particular moment, not a judgment on your significance. This shift does not happen naturally or instantly. It requires deliberate, consistent, patient attention. Here is a practical approach you can begin applying immediately. The next time you notice yourself feeling triggered by something someone said or did, pause before you respond, internally or externally, and ask yourself one question. What else could this mean? Then push your mind to generate at least 3 alternative explanations, all of them plausible and none of them about you. Perhaps they are carrying something heavy today. Perhaps they misread the situation entirely. Perhaps they are responding from a place of their own fear or insecurity. This simple mental exercise does something important. It weakens the automatic emotional response by introducing logic at the precise moment when ego usually steps in and takes over. Because the majority of emotional reactions are ego-driven at their core, the ego seeks acknowledgement. The ego needs to be seen as correct. The ego requires respect and validation and a certain level of recognition. When it does not receive those things, it reacts, loudly, quickly, and often in ways that create more problems than the original situation contained. But genuine maturity begins the moment you recognize something deeply uncomfortable. Not everything requires your defense. Not every interaction deserves your explanation. Not every challenge to your position requires your emotional investment. There is real strength, not weakness, but strength, in choosing selectively where your engagement goes. Why do we take things personally in the first place, at the deepest level? Because of identity. When someone challenges your idea, your brain interprets it as a challenge to your intelligence. When someone questions your decision, you hear doubt directed at your capability and your judgment. When someone becomes distant or stops communicating, you interpret the silence as a statement about your worth. You have merged their external behavior with your internal sense of self. And when identity feels threatened, emotion does not rise gradually. It spikes. It demands a response. To stay consistently unbothered, you must practice, and eventually master, the separation of external behavior from your internal self-worth. You are not your last mistake. You are not someone's current opinion of you. You are not defined by a single interaction, a single misunderstanding, or a single moment that did not go the way you needed it to go. When you understand this, not just as an intellectual concept, but as something you genuinely feel in your body, the volume of external criticism and misalignment decreases naturally. Because your internal foundation is no longer shaking when pressure is applied to it. There is an account worth sitting with. A senior executive in a high-pressure environment was known among his colleagues for almost never reacting emotionally during meetings, even when challenged with clear aggression by people who were openly adversarial. A younger team member finally asked him directly how he maintained that level of composure when everyone else in the room was charged with tension. He answered without hesitation. If I responded to every tone in this room, I would never produce sound decisions. I listen for information, not for emotion. When someone's voice rises, I hear intensity, not disrespect. When someone challenges a plan, I hear data, not attack. That separation between content and ego was not something he was born with. It was something he built through years of deliberate practice. Start building it in small moments. When someone is short with you in conversation, try replacing the thought they are being disrespectful with the thought they are carrying something today. When you are not included in something you expected to be part of, replace the thought, they excluded me deliberately, with the thought, this particular thing was not about me. These reinterpretations will not always be perfect. They will not always be entirely accurate. But here is what matters most. Even in the moments when something is genuinely about you, when someone really is being dismissive or careless, reacting from emotion rarely improves the situation. What it does is transfer their instability into your nervous system. It costs you something that took time to build. Staying unbothered is not about being uninformed or naive about human behavior. It is about being strategically wise with your emotional energy. Every single time you choose not to personalize something that does not require it, you conserve a form of inner strength. Your nervous system remains regulated. Your clarity remains intact. And clarity in every area of life is where genuine power lives. In quantum field research, the number 108 carries a significance that extends across disciplines. It appears in sacred geometry, in the mathematical relationships between celestial bodies, in vibrational patterns studied across ancient and modern traditions alike. It is considered a number of completion, of internal alignment becoming visible in the external world, of harmony restored between what is felt internally and what is expressed outward. Researchers studying resonance frequencies have noted that 108 represents a point of convergence, where scattered energy becomes coherent, where noise settles into signal. If this first principle, the decision to stop personalizing what was never truly personal, has landed somewhere real inside you, leave the number 108 in the comments right now. Let this Elite Success Audiobooks community see that you are choosing coherence over reactivity, alignment over ego, and grounded awareness over automatic response. Your presence here is not accidental, and your comment will carry further than you currently understand. Because what this principle ultimately reveals is both simple and profound. When you stop taking everything personally, you do not become disconnected from life. You become connected to something far more dependable, your own stable, grounded awareness. You stop functioning as a surface that reflects every shadow in the room. You become something steadier, something that does not flicker every time the conditions around it change. That steadiness is not inherited. It is not a feature of certain personalities and absent from others. It is built. One moment of pause at a time. One deliberate reinterpretation at a time. One conscious choice to observe rather than absorb. Repeated until it becomes the way you naturally move through the world. And each time you make that choice, each time you decide that someone else's emotional weather does not have to become your forecast, your internal foundation grows stronger. Not louder, not more defended or more hardened, simply stronger. More rooted in something that external circumstances cannot easily reach. More genuinely, quietly, powerfully unbothered. That is where this journey begins. And from this foundation, everything that follows becomes possible. This is not a passive shift. It is not something that occurs simply because you have heard it described. It requires the kind of daily, quiet, unglamorous practice that most people are unwilling to commit to. Because most people are waiting for a dramatic transformation, rather than trusting the accumulating power of small, consistent choices made in ordinary moments. The person who does not react to the sharp comment in the morning meeting. The person who reads the critical message and waits before responding. The person who notices the emotional surge rising in their chest and chooses, deliberately, patiently, not to be carried by it. That is the practice. And that practice, sustained over time, does not just change how you respond in difficult situations. It changes who you understand yourself to be. Identity is the deepest layer of this work, because the way you behave in emotionally charged moments is not just a pattern. It is a statement about how you see yourself. If you believe you are someone who gets triggered easily, you will confirm that belief with your behavior. If you begin to build evidence through small, repeated acts of restraint and clarity that you are someone who responds rather than reacts, that new identity becomes the architecture of your daily experience. You stop performing composure for others. People, you start actually living inside it. And that is the moment the work becomes something different. It stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like freedom. Because when you no longer need to react to every provocation, when you no longer feel compelled to defend every assumption, when you no longer require external events to be organized in your favor before you can feel stable, you discover something that very few people in the world actually possess. You discover what it feels like to be genuinely, durably, quietly unbothered. Not because life became easier, but because you became stronger than the difficulty. That is where Volume 1 ends. And what comes next builds directly on this foundation. The unbothered person is not someone who has been spared difficulty. They are someone who has decided, quietly and without announcement, that difficulty does not get to define what happens inside them. That is the decision this principle invites you to make. Not once, in a single dramatic moment of resolution, but repeatedly, in the small, ordinary moments where reaction is automatic and restraint is chosen anyway. Each of those moments is a vote. A vote for the version of yourself that is stable enough to be trusted, present enough to be effective, grounded enough to remain unbothered even when life is doing everything it can to move you. There is a moment that exists inside every difficult interaction. It is small. It is easy to miss entirely. It lives in the space between what just happened and what you are about to do about it. Most people have never noticed this moment because their nervous system moves through it too quickly. From stimulus straight into To stay unbothered in the world you actually live in, you must gradually retrain that pattern. You must teach your mind and your body that not every emotional surge demands immediate behavioral output. And the most effective entry point for that retraining is something almost embarrassingly simple. But do not let its simplicity mislead you about its power. The 3-second pause. When you feel triggered, when you notice the emotional charge building, when the urge to react becomes strong, do nothing for 3 seconds. No speaking, no typing, no visible response. Simply breathe. Inhale slowly and with intention. Exhale with the same deliberate control. Those 3 seconds interrupt the automatic cycle that your nervous system has been running. They send a signal, a quiet internal signal, that you are not in danger, that you are choosing, that the situation requires your thinking mind, not your survival instinct. 3 seconds sounds almost trivially small, but it is powerful precisely because it interrupts the pattern at the critical moment before it completes. Once the pattern completes, you are already in reaction. Once you have already spoken from that charged state, the direction of the interaction has already shifted. The 3-second pause stops the completion of the pattern and opens a doorway to a different quality of response entirely. Once you pause, you gain access to a question that reactive people almost never get to ask. What outcome do I actually want here? Not, how do I protect my image right now? Not, how do I make sure they understand they were wrong? Not, how do I win this exchange? But rather, what response serves me best in this situation over time in the broader context of who I am trying to become? That question is only available to the person who has paused long enough to ask it. And the answer to that question almost never points toward reactive escalation. Consider a scenario that is common in workplaces and relationships alike. Someone challenges your idea or your judgment in a public setting. Your immediate instinct, the ego's instinct, is to correct them sharply and immediately, to reestablish your position, to prevent anyone else in the room from misinterpreting their challenge as a successful one. The surge of that instinct can feel almost irresistible. But instead of following it, you pause for 3 seconds. You breathe. You access the question. And then you respond calmly, with steadiness in your voice. That is an interesting perspective. Let us examine it more closely. The energy in the room shifts. You did not escalate. You did not collapse. You did not become defensive or emotional in a way that would have handed control of the situation to someone else. You controlled the tone, and the person who controls the tone controls the direction. People do not primarily remember the content of charged exchanges. They remember the emotional quality. They remember who held their composure and who lost it. And the one who held their composure is consistently, reliably, almost universally perceived as more authoritative. Not because they were louder or more aggressive, but because they were steadier. Creating that space also functions as a form of protection. Some people provoke intentionally, not because they have a genuine grievance, but because they want to determine how much influence they have over your internal state. They push to see what they can move. They test to see what they can control. If you can be triggered easily, if your emotional state can be rearranged by a single, well-placed comment, then they have established leverage over you. If you cannot be moved so easily, if the same comment lands and your expression remains neutral and your tone remains measured, then that leverage does not exist. Composure removes the tool that provocation depends on. Now, there is honesty required here. Pausing in the moment of emotional surge is genuinely uncomfortable. When the emotion rises, it arrives with a sense of urgency. It feels as though expression is required immediately, as though waiting even a few seconds is a form of weakness or surrender. That urgency is not real. It is a feeling generated by the nervous system in a state of activation. It is not information about what is actually true or what is actually needed. Emotion is a wave. It rises, it peaks, it passes. If you observe it without acting from it, moves through you. If you act at its peak, you amplify its effects and extend its duration. There is a story that illustrates this with unusual clarity. A man who worked in a high-stakes environment where tense communications were frequent developed a practice over years of personal discipline. Every email he wrote from a place of anger or frustration, he would compose in full, letting himself say everything he felt needed to be said, and then never send it immediately. He would let it sit for 24 hours. The following morning, he would reread what he had written. In the overwhelming majority of cases, he deleted it entirely. Because the emotion that had felt urgent, that had felt absolutely necessary to express in the moment, had settled. Time had given him access to a perspective that the moment itself could not provide. What had felt like a vital response had revealed itself, in the clarity of the next day, as simply an emotional discharge that would have created more complexity than it resolved. You can apply this principle in smaller increments across the situations of your daily life. Delay your reply to the message that irritates you. Step away from the room where the tension is rising before you respond. Lower the volume of your voice deliberately at the exact moment when everything in you wants to raise it. Each of these small behavioral choices reinforces the same internal message. I am the one who decides how I respond, not the situation, not the other person, not the emotion surging through my chest. Me. And here is what accumulates from that reinforcement over time. It becomes identity. You stop experiencing yourself as someone who simply reacts to what happens around them. You begin experiencing yourself as someone who stays composed, someone for whom steadiness is not an occasional achievement, but a consistent way of operating. Identity shapes behavior in profound and often underappreciated ways. When you genuinely believe you are a calm person, you act from that belief. When you believe you are impulsive and easily triggered, you act from that belief instead. So the work of expanding the space between stimulus and reaction is also, fundamentally, the work of constructing a new identity, one built not from hope or aspiration, but from the accumulated evidence of small, repeated moments of deliberate composure. There is an essential distinction to carry forward here. What we are describing is not suppression. Suppression pushes emotion down. It denies that the feeling is present. It buries what needs to be processed and allows it to accumulate in ways that eventually surface in more damaging forms. What we are describing is regulation. Regulation fully acknowledges that the emotion is present. It does not pretend otherwise, and simply chooses the timing and quality of its expression. You might still address the issue. You might still set a firm boundary. You might still communicate disagreement with clarity and directness. But you do it from a place of stability rather than from the peak of emotional surge. You do it from steadiness rather than from reactivity. And that steadiness communicates something beyond words. It communicates, I am not threatened. When you are not operating from a sense of threat, your thinking expands rather than narrows. Your language becomes more precise. Your posture communicates confidence rather than defensiveness. Your tone carries authority rather than agitation. All of this from the practice of creating a few seconds, sometimes even just a breath, of deliberate space. In the study of quantum resonance and vibrational frequencies, the number 432 holds a significant place. At 432 Hz, sound waves have been observed to produce patterns of unusual coherence, geometric formations of striking order and symmetry. Researchers and musicians working with this frequency describe a quality of alignment and calm that standard tuning does not produce in the same way. At 432 Hz, the relationship between vibration and form becomes extraordinarily precise. Energy that was scattered finds its pattern. Noise that was chaotic settles into something structured. The space between stimulus and reaction operates in a similar way. When you create that pause, when you introduce even a moment of deliberate stillness between what happens and what you do about it, you allow scattered emotional energy to find a coherent pattern. You shift from the chaotic frequency of reactive impulse to something closer to the structured, intentional frequency of a composed and grounded response. If this principle has created any kind of internal shift in the way you understand the relationship between feeling and behavior, leave the number 432 in the comments below. Let this Elite Success Audiobooks community feel the resonance of people choosing alignment over automatic reaction and coherent response over chaotic impulse. Life will continue to present you with situations that activate your nervous system. People will continue to say things that create a charge in your chest. Circumstances will continue to surprise and sometimes frustrate, and occasionally genuinely anger you. You cannot remove those triggers from a life that is fully lived, but you can expand the gap. You can widen the space between what arrives and what you choose to do with it. And inside that widened space, your discipline lives. Inside that space, your genuine power resides. Inside that space is the difference between a life that feels like it is happening to you and a life that feels like you are actually choosing it. The more you practice expanding that space, the more you repeat the pause, the breath, the deliberate question about what outcome you actually want, the more naturally it occurs. And as it becomes more natural, something changes in how external pressure lands. It does not stop arriving, but it no longer arrives with the same automatic authority over your internal state. You begin to notice the wave rising. You begin to feel the surge without being immediately swept by it. You begin to occupy a position slightly outside the automatic response, observing it, choosing whether to follow it, deciding from steadiness rather than from surge. That is emotional mastery in its most practical and most human form. Not the absence of feeling, not the performance of calm for the benefit of onlookers, but the genuine, practiced, hard-earned ability to hold feeling without being held captive by it. To feel the full intensity of what is present without losing access to the part of you that can still think, still choose, still respond with integrity and intention. That is what the space between stimulus and reaction, carefully and consistently expanded, ultimately produces. And that is a kind of freedom that no external circumstance can easily take away. There is a story that illustrates this principle at a different scale, one that moves beyond the individual moment and into the larger pattern of a life. A woman who worked in a demanding professional environment that required constant negotiation and constant exposure to conflict described the transformation she experienced over several years of deliberately practicing the pause. In her early career, she was known, to herself and to others, as someone who was sharp and effective, but also quick to escalate when challenged. She had the skills and the intelligence that her role required, but her emotional reactivity was costing her in ways she could not fully measure at the time. She began practicing the pause not because someone told her to, but because she had become tired of regretting things she said in charged moments. She started small, simply counting 3 seconds internally before responding to anything that produced a feeling in her chest. Not 3 minutes, not a dramatic withdrawal from the situation, just 3 seconds. A breath, a moment of quiet choosing. At first, it felt deeply unnatural. The urge to respond immediately was powerful. The discomfort of not expressing what she felt right away felt almost physically uncomfortable. But she kept practicing. Week after week, situation after situation, 3 seconds at a time. Months later, she described something that surprised her. It was not just that she responded better in difficult moments, though she did. It was that the difficult moments themselves had started to feel different. The same situations that had once produced an immediate, powerful emotional charge were now arriving with less intensity. Not because the situations had changed, because her nervous system had recalibrated. The repeated practice of pausing had gradually altered the automatic quality of her responses. The space that once had to be deliberately created was beginning to appear naturally. That is what sustained practice of this principle ultimately produces. Not just better responses in difficult moments, but a fundamentally different relationship with difficulty itself. The charged moment that once felt urgent and threatening gradually becomes something more like information, something to be processed with composure rather than met with reactive escalation. And when difficulty is experienced as information rather than threat, your entire capacity for navigating it expands. There is also something worth examining about what happens to your relationships and to your influence when you consistently demonstrate this quality. When people around you, colleagues, family members, friends, anyone who interacts with you across time, observe that you do not escalate when provoked, that you do not match emotional intensity with more emotional intensity, that you remain grounded in moments when most people would have already reacted, something shifts in how they relate to you. You become someone who feels safe, not passive, not pushover, safe, in the specific sense that they know the interaction will not spiral into unnecessary damage simply because one moment became charged. That quality of predictable composure builds a kind of trust that reactive behavior can never build, no matter how justified the reaction might have been. And in that trust lives something that most people want, but few ever deliberately construct: genuine influence. Not the influence that comes from volume or aggression or the performance of confidence. The influence that comes from being demonstrably, consistently, reliably steady when the pressure is real. That is the person people turn to when something genuinely difficult needs to be navigated. Not because they are the loudest voice in the room, but because they are the one voice that does not change quality when the room becomes chaotic. That is what you are building. 3 seconds at a time, one deliberate breath at a time, one chosen response rather than automatic reaction at a time. And the accumulation of those moments, small and unglamorous as each individual one might be, is the architecture of a life that feels genuinely, durably, powerfully in control. Not because external events cooperate with your preferences, but because you have built something inside yourself that external events can no longer so easily rearrange. The space between feeling and response is yours. It has always been yours. The work is simply learning to inhabit it, deliberately, consistently, and with the kind of patient discipline that transforms a practice into an identity and an identity into a life. That life, the one built from composure rather than reaction, from choice rather than impulse, from the 3-second pause repeated until it becomes second nature, is the life of someone who has genuinely learned to stay unbothered, not as a performance, as a way of being. What this second principle ultimately asks of you is something that feels counterintuitive when you first encounter it. It asks you to become comfortable with the discomfort of not reacting. It asks you to sit inside the emotional charge, to feel it fully without immediately expressing it, and to discover through repeated experience that you can survive that discomfort without the situation requiring your immediate behavioral output. Every time you survive it, the discomfort itself diminishes slightly. The urgency that emotion generates, that sense that you must respond right now, that waiting is weakness, that the feeling demands immediate expression, loses some of its authority. And as that authority decreases, your authority over your own responses increases. The pause becomes easier. The breath becomes more natural. The question about what outcome you actually want becomes a reflex rather than an effort. And the grounded, composed, deliberately chosen response becomes not the exception to how you operate, but the consistent standard of it. That is the transformation this principle makes possible, not through a single dramatic shift, through 3 seconds repeated until they become the architecture of who you are. And once that standard is established, once composure is no longer something you reach for in difficult moments, but something you inhabit as a consistent condition, you will discover what it actually feels like to move through the world without being at the mercy of every emotional wave that passes through you. You will discover that the calm you have been building is not a limitation on your aliveness. It is not a reduction of your passion or your intensity or your investment in the things that genuinely matter to you. It is the opposite. It is the condition that makes your passion sustainable, your intensity purposeful, and your investment in what matters genuinely effective. Because you are no longer spending the energy that passion requires on defending yourself from every passing provocation. You are channeling it into the things that actually deserve it. That redirection, from reactive output to deliberate, directed energy, is what makes the grounded, unbothered person not just more composed, but consistently more effective. Consistently more impactful, consistently more aligned with the outcomes they are genuinely pursuing. 3 seconds, 1 breath, 1 question, repeated until it becomes identity. That is the practice. And from that practice, everything in the chapters that follow will build with increasing depth and increasing precision toward the unbothered life that is already, in some quiet way, waiting for you to construct it. Not as a destination you arrive at once and then simply possess. As a practice you return to every day, in every situation that tests you, with every breath you take between stimulus and response. That is the work, and it is the most important work you will ever do. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is the foundation upon which every other form of mastery is built. The foundation of steady presence, of reliable composure, of a life experienced not as something that is constantly happening to you, but as something you are genuinely, consistently, powerfully choosing. the stimulus will keep coming. The waves will keep rising. Life will continue to do what it has always done. But you, practiced, grounded, and deliberate, will no longer be at its mercy. Because the space between feeling and response belongs to you, and you have learned how to live inside it. One of the most quietly exhausting experiences a person can have is the experience of being misunderstood by someone whose understanding matters to them. It does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to involve accusations or arguments or any visible conflict at all. It can be as simple as someone forming an opinion about your intentions that does not reflect your actual intentions. Someone assuming something about your character that is not true. Someone telling a version of your story that leaves out the parts that would change everything. And the moment you realize it is happening, something inside you activates immediately. A tightening, a surge, a powerful, almost physical need to correct the record, to explain, to be seen accurately, to have your actual self recognized rather than someone else's interpretation of it. That need is deeply human. It is rooted in something ancient and real, the need for belonging, the need to be known, the need for the gap between how you experience yourself and how others experience you to be as small as possible. When someone misunderstands you, it does not just feel like a factual error. It can feel like a form of loss, like something important has been taken from you without your consent. But here is the difficult truth that this third principle requires you to sit with. If your emotional stability depends on other people understanding you accurately, if your sense of calm rises and falls with whether the people around you have correctly interpreted your intentions and your character, then your stability is not truly yours. It is borrowed. It is contingent. And a stability that belongs to someone else's perception cannot be called genuine composure. It can only be called luck. There will always be people who see you through a lens you did not provide and cannot control. Their experiences before they met you, their personal insecurities, their existing beliefs, their current emotional state. All of these shape how they interpret your behavior, regardless of what your behavior actually means. You cannot control that lens. You cannot clean it. You cannot replace it. And the energy spent trying to do so is energy that belongs to something genuinely worth pursuing. Think about the mental bandwidth consumed by the process of managing misunderstanding. You replay the conversation that went sideways, searching for the exact moment where their interpretation diverged from your intention. You construct perfect explanations in quiet moments, in the shower, during the commute, in the space between sleep and waking, that you are almost certain would resolve everything if only you could deliver them at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right tone. You imagine future interactions where the full truth finally becomes visible, and the misunderstanding dissolves, and you are seen accurately at last. All of that is real cognitive and emotional labor. And most of the time, it changes nothing. Because misunderstanding is not always about missing information. It is not always a simple matter of someone not having heard the full story. Sometimes people do not want clarity. Sometimes the interpretation they have formed serves something in them. It confirms an existing belief. It supports a particular emotional position. It protects them from having to reconsider something they are invested in. When someone is committed to misunderstanding you, providing more information does not create understanding. It gives them more material to reinterpret through the same distorted lens. When you fully absorb that reality, something important shifts. You stop chasing approval that has been dressed up as explanation. You begin to recognize the difference between the clarification that genuinely serves a relationship and the over-explanation that is actually just the ego trying to manage its image. And you begin to develop the quietest, most underestimated form of confidence that exists. The confidence that does not require external confirmation to stay intact. There is a composure that becomes visible in people who have genuinely released the need to be understood by everyone. It is not arrogance. It is not the affected nonchalance of someone who has simply learned to perform indifference. It is something deeper and more real than either of those things. It is the calm of a person who genuinely knows, in the way that only sustained self-awareness can produce, who they are and what they stand for, and who has discovered through experience that that knowledge does not require validation from the outside in order to remain stable. That calm communicates without words. It says, "I know my intentions. I know my character. I know the effort I have put into becoming the person I am trying to be." Your interpretation of that does not threaten what I know to be true about it. That is not a statement made with defensiveness or aggression. It is simply a statement made from a foundation that external opinion cannot easily reach. This does not mean that clarification is never appropriate or that communication does not matter. Context matters profoundly. The relationship matters. The situation matters. Some misunderstandings are worth addressing because the relationship that contains them has genuine value, and the other person is genuinely open to understanding. Eventually, she stopped. Not because she had given up, because she had recognized something. The explanation was not for them. It was for her. She was using their anticipated approval as a substitute for her own internal certainty, and the certainty was not going to come from their understanding. It was going to come from the evidence she accumulated through consistent, disciplined action toward the thing she had chosen. So she redirected the energy. She stopped explaining and started building. She stopped defending and started developing. And years later, the same people who had questioned her decision most vocally were describing her courage in terms that she no longer needed to hear. Because by then, the internal foundation she had built through that period of sustained, unsupported effort had become something no external opinion could meaningfully add to or subtract from. Letting people misunderstand you requires trust in a specific sequence. First, trust in your own character, in the actual substance of who you are and what you stand for, which exists independently of whether anyone else can currently see it. Second, trust in your path. in the direction you have chosen and the reasons behind it, even when those reasons are difficult to translate into terms that make sense to people who are not inside your experience. Third, trust in time, in the understanding that consistency, sustained long enough, creates its own kind of clarity, that the truth of who you are does not depend on your ability to explain it. It depends on your willingness to keep living it. Not every assumption requires a response. Not every rumor demands your correction. Not every critical opinion requires your engagement. Sometimes silence is not the absence of strength. Sometimes silence is the most precise expression of it. It communicates, without a single word, something that words alone rarely manage to convey. I know who I am. I do not need your agreement to continue being that person. The more you build that internal certainty through consistent action, through honest self-examination, through the quiet accumulation of evidence that you are moving in alignment with your actual values, the less urgency you feel around misunderstanding. Not because you become indifferent to the quality of your relationships or to the way people experience you, but because your sense of self is no longer suspended from their perception like a coat on a hook that they control. Your identity has its own foundation, and misunderstanding, while never entirely comfortable, no longer has the power to destabilize it. That stability is magnetic in ways that are difficult to explain, but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. In a world where most people are quietly and constantly managing their image, adjusting their presentation, measuring the gap between how they want to be seen and how they fear they are being seen, the person who has stopped doing that stands out. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quality of presence that other people feel immediately and find themselves responding to without always being able to articulate why. It is the presence of someone who is not performing, who is not scanning the room for reactions, who is not adjusting themselves in real time based on what they think the audience requires, who is simply, consistently, genuinely themselves, and who has made peace with the fact that not everyone will interpret that accurately, and who has decided that their peace does not depend on everyone doing so. That is the third principle in full. Let people misunderstand you, not as resignation, not as passivity, but as the deliberate, confident, grounded choice of someone who knows that their worth is not located in other people's perceptions of them, and who has built the internal foundation to live from that knowledge consistently, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is lonely, even when the misunderstanding feels unfair. Because it often will feel unfair, and you will survive it. And in surviving it with your composure and your integrity intact, you will discover something that external validation has never been able to provide. You will discover the particular freedom of a person who no longer needs the world to see them accurately in order to know exactly who they are. And that freedom, the freedom of a person whose inner stability is genuinely their own, is the foundation from which everything in the remaining principles will be built. Because once you no longer need external understanding to stay grounded, once your sense of self is no longer a hostage to other people's perceptions, you gain access to a quality of presence that transforms not just how you experience yourself, but how you move through every relationship, every challenge, and every test that life continues to bring. There is a deeper layer to this principle that is worth examining before we move forward. The need for universal understanding, for everyone to see you accurately and interpret your actions charitably and recognize your intentions correctly, is often connected to something that runs beneath the surface of daily awareness. It is connected to the fear of irrelevance, to the ancient, deeply human anxiety that if you are misunderstood long enough or thoroughly enough, you will somehow disappear from the social world that gives life much of its meaning, that you will be erased by narrative rather than by anything you actually did. That fear is understandable, but it is also worth examining with the kind of honest clarity that this entire practice is designed to develop. Because the people who are least misunderstood are not necessarily the ones who explain themselves most thoroughly. They are the ones who are most consistently themselves, whose behavior across time creates a pattern so clear and so reliable that misunderstanding cannot sustain itself indefinitely in the face of it. Consistency is a form of communication that operates below the level of words. It speaks in a register that explanation cannot access, and it accumulates in ways that explanation simply cannot replicate. This means that the most effective response to being misunderstood is often not more explanation. It is more consistency, more aligned action, more evidence accumulated through the simple, repeated, unglamorous act of being exactly who you say you are and doing exactly what you say you will do, across circumstances where it would be easier not to. Over time, that consistency rewrites narratives that explanation never could. Not through force, not through persuasion, through the irresistible clarity of a pattern that cannot be denied. There is also something important to acknowledge about the emotional texture of this practice. Letting people misunderstand you without rushing to correct them is not a comfortable experience, particularly in the early stages of building this particular form of composure. There is a grief in it, a small but real grief at the gap between how you experience yourself and how you are being experienced. That grief is legitimate. It does not need to be suppressed or dismissed. It can be acknowledged fully and still not allowed to drive behavior. You can feel the discomfort of being misread and still choose not to over-explain. You can feel the sting of an unfair assumption and still decide that correcting it is not the best use of your energy in this particular moment. Feeling the discomfort and choosing your behavior anyway, that is not suppression. That is regulation. And it is the heart of what emotional mastery actually looks like in practice. The composure that emerges from releasing the need for universal understanding is qualitatively different from any other form of composure. It is not the composure of someone who has learned to hide their reactions. It is not the composure of someone who has simply become numb to misalignment. It is the composure of someone who has built a relationship with themselves that is strong enough to remain stable even when the relationship between their self-image and others' perceptions of them has a significant gap. That stability, earned through practice, built through patience, sustained through consistent alignment with your actual values, is the most durable form of emotional grounding that exists. Because it does not depend on conditions. It does not require favorable circumstances or accurate perception, or the cooperation of people who may not be capable of providing it. It exists independently of all of those things. And that independence, that genuine, practiced, hard-earned independence from the need for external confirmation, is what being truly unbothered actually feels like from the inside. Not cold, not distant, not indifferent to the quality of your connections with other people, but free. Free from the exhausting, continuous labor of image management. Free from the anxiety of monitoring how you are being perceived and adjusting yourself in real time to close the gap. Free to simply be who you are, clearly, consistently, without apology and without performance, and to trust that the people worth trusting will, over time, see it. That is the third principle in practice, and the life it produces, quieter in some ways than the life of someone constantly managing their image, but immeasurably more stable and more genuinely free, is the life that all the remaining principles are building toward. One layer of unnecessary dependency removed at a time. One choice toward internal authority made at a time, until the foundation is solid enough that nothing outside you can easily reach it. What this principle ultimately teaches, beneath all the specific techniques and reframes and practical approaches, is something that cannot be given to you by any external source. It can only be discovered through the experience of actually doing it, of actually allowing a misunderstanding to exist without rushing to resolve it, of actually sitting with the discomfort of being seen inaccurately by someone whose opinion you care about, and choosing your composure anyway, of actually letting your behavior across time make the argument that your words could not. When you do that, when you make that choice repeatedly, in real moments, with real discomfort, at real cost to the ego's preference for immediate vindication, something consolidates inside you that has no equivalent in the life of someone who always explains, always defends, always manages their image with anxious precision. What consolidates is authority. Not the authority that comes from position or from persuasion. The authority that comes from a person who clearly, demonstrably, consistently knows who they are, and who does not need the room to agree in order to continue living from that knowledge. That authority is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not require acknowledgement, but it is felt by everyone in contact with it. And it changes every interaction, every relationship, and every circumstance it touches. Not through force, but through the simple, profound, uncommon power of a person who is genuinely, completely, unshakably themselves. That is what you are building. And this is where the next layer of it begins. The person who reaches this point, who has practiced releasing the need for universal understanding long enough that it begins to feel natural rather than effortful, experiences a specific and identifiable shift in their daily relationship with other people. Conversations become less loaded. Interactions that would have previously produced anxiety or defensive preparation are approached with something closer to genuine curiosity. Because when your sense of self is not riding on how the other person interprets you, you are free to actually listen to them, to be genuinely present in the exchange rather than partly absent, monitoring their signals for evidence of whether they are seeing you correctly. That presence, that full, unhurried, non-defensive attention, is itself a form of connection that image management can never produce. And it is what the unbothered person, who no longer needs everyone's understanding to stay grounded, is finally free to offer. Completely, without reservation, without the quiet background anxiety of a person whose stability is always, in some sense, depending on what the other person decides to think of them next. That freedom, to be fully present without the armor of image management, is among the most valuable gifts this practice can deliver. And it is waiting on the other side of every moment you choose internal authority over external validation. Everything that has been built across the first three principles, the ability to stop internalizing what was never personal, to create deliberate space between feeling and response, to release the need for universal understanding. All of it converges in the fourth and final set of principles, the ones that deal directly with how you manage the ongoing relationship between your internal state and the external world, the way you handle unresolved situations, the way you relate to discomfort, the way you choose your battles, and the way you protect the most fundamental resource you have, your energy. There is an emotional trap that most people encounter repeatedly throughout their lives, often without ever fully recognizing it for what it is. It is the trap of waiting. Waiting for the conversation that will finally make everything make sense. Waiting for the apology that will validate what you experienced. Waiting for the acknowledgement that will allow you to move forward. Waiting for the ending that was supposed to happen. The clean, resolved, clearly understood conclusion to a chapter that simply did not close the way you needed it to close. The need for closure is one of the most quietly powerful forces that keeps people emotionally tied to situations and people that have, in practical terms, already ended. It is the need that keeps the past alive inside the present, and it is worth examining with considerable honesty. The mind has a strong aversion to unfinished stories. When a situation ends without resolution, when someone leaves without explanation, when a conflict dissolves without acknowledgement, when a relationship changes abruptly and the meaning of that change is never clearly communicated, the mind does not simply accept the ambiguity and file it away. It continues working on it. It replays the conversations that existed and constructs the conversations that should have happened. It imagines scenarios where accountability is finally reached, where the truth is finally acknowledged, where justice, in whatever form felt most needed, is finally served. That cognitive and emotional labor can continue for an extraordinary length of time, months, sometimes years, sometimes decades. Because the mind does not stop working on an unfinished story simply because the story is no longer active in your daily life. It keeps the file open. But here is the truth about closure that genuinely changes the relationship with unresolved situations. Closure is not something that another person grants you. It is not something that a final conversation produces, or that a long-awaited apology delivers, or that the perfect explanation, the one that would finally make everything make sense, provides. Closure is a decision. It is an internal act of acceptance that you perform, not a gift that someone else eventually chooses to offer. And when your peace depends on someone else making that offering, your peace will often wait indefinitely. Think about the specific quality of energy that is consumed by waiting for someone to give you what you need in order to feel complete about what happened. You hold space in your awareness for them, for the possibility of the conversation, for the moment when they finally acknowledge what occurred. That held space is not neutral. It is active. It is attention that belongs to your present and your future, but is being spent on a past that has already determined its own shape. And the person you are waiting on, in most cases, is not waiting at all. They have moved on. You are emotionally connected to a situation that, from the other side, may no longer exist as a live concern. When you recognize that asymmetry clearly, something begins to shift. The question is no longer, when will they give me what I need in order to move on? The question becomes, what would it mean to give that to myself? And giving it to yourself begins with acceptance. Acceptance that the situation occurred. Acceptance that it may never be resolved in the way you needed it to be resolved. Acceptance that the explanation you wanted may never come. Acceptance that the apology may never arrive. Not because these things are not deserved, often they are, but because waiting for them to arrive is costing you something that is worth more than the resolution would provide. This does not mean you ignore what happened or pretend it did not matter. It does not mean you suppress the legitimate hurt or disappointment that the unresolved situation produced. It means you stop making the processing of that hurt conditional on the other person's participation. You process it yourself. You validate your own experience. The hurt was real. The disappointment was legitimate. The expectation that was violated deserved to be honored. You acknowledge all of that fully. And then you make the decision, not once perhaps, but repeatedly as the need arises, to move forward without requiring their acknowledgement before you do. The trap that the need for closure often sets is subtle. It disguises itself as something reasonable and even virtuous. Of course, I need to understand what happened before I can move on. Of course, I need the conversation before I can heal. Of course, I need them to acknowledge what they did before I can release it. But in most cases, the need for the conversation and the need for the acknowledgement are serving a different function than they appear to be serving. They are not primarily about understanding. They are about attachment. They are the mind's way of maintaining connection to a situation that the emotional system is not yet ready to release. Dressed up in the language of resolution so that the attachment feels justified, rather than merely painful. When you see through that mechanism, when you recognize that the thing you are calling a need for closure is often actually a need for continued connection, even to something that harmed you, the grip of it loosens. Not because the hurt disappears, but because you understand what the real work is. The real work is not getting the explanation. The real work is releasing the attachment. And releasing the attachment does not require their participation. It requires only yours. There is a story that illustrates this clearly. Two people had built a professional partnership over several years that ended abruptly and with significant pain on one side. The partner who felt most betrayed by how the ending was handled spent months replaying conversations, drafting messages he never sent, waiting for a moment of acknowledgement from someone who had moved on entirely and showed no indication of ever providing it. He told himself he just needed to understand what went wrong. He told himself one honest conversation would allow him to close the chapter and redirect his energy. But months passed, and the honest conversation never came. And in the absence of it, his energy remained allocated to the past. The moment that changed his relationship with the situation was not a conversation. It was a recognition. He realized, clearly and without drama, that no explanation he could receive would actually change the outcome. The partnership was over. The behavior that had hurt him had already occurred. The relationship between what had happened and what could now be done about it had already been determined. The only active element, the only thing still live and still costing him real energy, was his attachment to the narrative. Once he saw that, he made a different kind of decision. Not a decision about the other person, a decision about himself. He decided to redirect the energy, not because he had received what he needed, but because he recognized that waiting for it was the only thing still keeping him from what came next. That decision, to release the need for the perfect ending and to write your own continuation, is what self-generated closure actually looks like. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like triumph. In the early moments, it often feels more like surrender than resolution. But it is not surrender. It is the recognition of where your authority actually lives. It lives in what you do next, not in whether the other person finally does what they should have done. Distance can be closure. Redirected energy can be closure. The decision to stop allocating attention to an unresolved situation, not because it didn't matter, but because the present and the future matter more, can be closure. Silence, chosen deliberately from a place of self-respect rather than forced by circumstances, can be closure. You do not need their final chapter. You need your next one. The fifth principle moves us into territory that many people find counterintuitive, particularly in a culture that consistently frames discomfort as something to be solved, eliminated, or escaped as quickly as possible. The principle is this: your capacity to stay unbothered is directly proportional to your ability to tolerate discomfort without immediately reacting to it. Most emotional reactions,
Most of the impulsive, regrettable, relationship-damaging responses that people spend energy recovering from are not actually responses to the situation itself. They are responses to the discomfort that the situation produces. The discomfort of being criticized, the discomfort of being excluded, the discomfort of uncertainty, the discomfort of silence in a conversation that feels charged. And because discomfort is genuinely unpleasant, the instinct is to
Eliminate it immediately, through explanation, through confrontation, through any behavioral output that makes the feeling stop. But the behavioral output that is chosen in that state is almost never the optimal one. Because the state itself, the activated, discomfort-driven state that the nervous system enters when something feels threatening, narrows thinking, accelerates judgment, and prioritizes the immediate relief of the discomfort over the long-term quality of the outcome. In that state, you are not making your best decisions. You are making your fastest ones. And fast decisions made from discomfort are the source of a significant portion of the regret that most people accumulate over time. The work of becoming comfortable with discomfort is not the work of learning to enjoy it. It is the work of learning that you can survive it without acting from it. That the uncomfortable feeling can exist in your body and your mind without requiring immediate behavioral discharge. That you can sit inside the tightness, the heat, the urgency of the emotional response, and still choose your next move from something other than the need to make the feeling stop. Think about what happens physiologically when discomfort rises in a social or emotional context. Your heart rate increases, your breathing shortens, muscles in your chest and shoulders tighten, your thinking narrows to focus on the perceived threat. In that state, the nervous system is communicating urgency. Do something, respond, protect, react. But that urgency is a signal about the state of your nervous system, not about what the situation actually requires. Learning to read it as information rather than as command is where the real work of discomfort tolerance lives. The sixth principle, the one about releasing the need to win every argument, operates on similar ground. Every human interaction that involves disagreement contains an invitation to compete, to establish who is correct, to protect status, to demonstrate that your perspective is superior to the one being offered. And the ego accepts that invitation almost every time, because the ego experiences being wrong as a threat rather than as information. It experiences disagreement as attack rather than as perspective. And it responds accordingly, with defensiveness, with escalation, with the full emotional energy of someone defending something that feels genuinely important. But here is what that energy costs in the longer accounting. Every time you use emotional resources to win an argument, you are spending something that cannot be easily recovered. Not just the energy of the exchange itself, but the relational goodwill that escalation erodes, the clarity of thinking that emotional activation compromises, and the authority that reactive behavior consistently undermines. People do not remember who made the most compelling point in a heated exchange as often as they remember who maintained their composure when the exchange became heated. And the one who maintained composure even if they appeared to concede in the moment, is consistently perceived as more trustworthy, more grounded, and more genuinely influential. There is power in the willingness to let someone else feel right in the moment, not because you have surrendered your actual position, but because you have recognized that the position is not the thing most worth protecting. What is worth protecting is your clarity, your composure, and your relationship with your own emotional equilibrium. Those things are worth more over time than any single one argument. The eighth principle, protecting your energy like a leader, brings everything together. Because emotional stability is not primarily a function of intelligence or willpower, or even the strength of your intentions. It is a function of energy, specifically of how much you have, where you allocate it, and how deliberately you guard it from the constant, ambient, often invisible drains that a fully stimulated modern life continuously produces. Leaders at every level understand this instinctively. The most effective, most consistently grounded people you have ever encountered are not people from whom life withholds difficulty. They are people who manage where their attention goes with a specificity and discipline that most people never apply. They do not respond to everything. They do not engage with every provocation. They do not allow the urgency of other people's emotional states to automatically become the priority of their own. In the quantum field, the number 777 holds a significance that extends across mathematical, spiritual, and vibrational frameworks. It is associated with alignment, specifically with the alignment of thought, intention, and action into a coherent whole. Researchers studying resonant patterns have noted that 777 appears at the intersection of multiple sequences that describe stability, precision, and the movement of energy toward its highest expression. It is considered a frequency of completion, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of something becoming fully what it was designed to be. In the sense of scattered parts finding their coherent arrangement. Your energy, protected and directed with this level of intentionality, becomes exactly that, something finding its highest expression, something no longer scattered across reactions and defenses and explanations that never needed to happen, something fully available for what actually deserves it. If this final set of principles, the decision to create your own closure, to build your tolerance for discomfort, to choose your battles with wisdom, and to protect your energy like someone who understands its value, has landed somewhere real, leave the number 777 in the comments below. Let this Elite Success Audiobooks community feel what it means when scattered energy finds its pattern, when reaction becomes response, when noise becomes signal, when a life that once felt managed by external circumstances begins to feel genuinely directed from within. Life will continue to test you, not once, not in a single dramatic trial that you pass or fail and then move on from. Repeatedly, consistently, in small and large and unexpected ways that cannot be predicted or fully prepared for. That is not a pessimistic observation. It is simply an accurate one. And the accurate understanding of it is itself a form of preparation. Because the person who expects to be tested is not shocked by the test. They meet it from a position of readiness rather than surprise. Throughout this entire journey, one theme has run beneath every principle, every story, every practical approach. You do not become unbothered by making the world less challenging. You become unbothered by making yourself more stable than the challenges the world consistently brings. You have learned to stop internalizing what was never about you. You have learned to expand the space between what you feel and what you do with that feeling. You have learned to release the need for everyone's understanding. You have learned to create your own closure rather than waiting for someone else to provide it. You have learned to sit inside discomfort without immediately acting from it. You have learned to choose your engagements with wisdom rather than ego. And you have learned to protect your energy as the foundational resource that everything else depends on. Each of these capacities is real. The calmer you become, the more powerfully you will feel the contrast. Situations that once consumed hours of your mental bandwidth will settle in minutes. Comments that once shifted your entire day will register and pass without redirecting you. Silence that once produced anxiety will begin to feel like space rather than threat. Not because you have become indifferent to life, because you have built a foundation inside yourself that the surface conditions of life can no longer so easily rearrange. That steadiness, quiet, consistent, earned through practice rather than gifted through circumstance, is among the rarest qualities in a loud, reactive, constantly stimulated world. And it is magnetic in ways that extend far beyond the personal. The people around you will feel it. Interactions will shift. Relationships will deepen in ways that were not accessible when you were operating from a reactive base. Opportunities that require steady presence will begin to find you, because steady presence is what makes you genuinely reliable. And reliability is the foundation of every form of influence that actually lasts. This is not a promise of a specific outcome. No honest account of this work can make that promise, and this one will not. What can be said, carefully, accurately, and with full respect for both the intelligence of your mind and the authority of your own experience, is this: the consistent, disciplined practice of the principles in this audiobook has the genuine potential to change not just how you respond in difficult moments, but who you understand yourself to be across all of them. The person who meets the test steadily, who meets the provocation with composure, who meets the uncertainty without spiraling, who meets the misunderstanding without collapsing, who meets the difficulty of daily life with the kind of grounded, practiced, cultivated calm that most people spend their entire lives wishing they had and never quite building. That person is not a different species from you. They are the version of you that this practice builds, one deliberate choice at a time. The version that no longer needs external circumstances to arrange themselves favorably before the internal state can be stable. The version that carries its own foundation. The version that is, genuinely, completely, in the full depth of the word, unbothered. Carry this forward, not as motivation that fades when the feeling fades, as discipline that holds even when the motivation is absent. Not as inspiration you return to in difficult moments, as identity you inhabit across all of them. Become the person who pauses before reacting, who allows misunderstandings to exist without rushing to dissolve them, who creates their own closure and moves forward without waiting for permission, who protects their energy as the irreplaceable resource that everything else is built from. And when life tests you, as it will, as it always has, as it always will, you will remain steady, centered, grounded in something that external circumstances cannot reach. And that is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of the life that the journey makes possible. For the next 72 hours, practice 3 things with specific intention. First, before you respond to anything that activates an emotional charge, pause. Even 2 seconds. Even 1 deliberate breath. That pause is the practice in its most essential form. Second, allow 1 misunderstanding to exist this week without correcting it. Let it sit. Observe what happens inside you when you choose your peace over your need to be accurately seen. Notice how long the discomfort lasts. Notice what it costs and what it preserves. Third, identify 1 conversation or argument that is not serving your long-term stability and choose not to continue it. Not from avoidance, from the deliberate recognition that your energy deserves better allocation. These 3 practices, applied consistently across the next 72 hours, will produce a specific and identifiable shift in how your nervous system relates to external pressure. Not a dramatic transformation, a real one. The kind that accumulates over time into something permanent and structural. The kind that changes not just what you do in difficult moments, but how those moments feel when they arrive. You will notice, gradually, that the tests life brings have not stopped coming. They never will. But your relationship with them will have changed. The space between what happens and what you do about it will have expanded. The internal foundation will have deepened. The emotional reactivity that once felt automatic will have softened. Not because you suppressed it, but because you outgrew it, because you built something stronger than it, something that holds feeling without being held captive by it, something that meets pressure without being defined by it, something genuinely, durably, quietly unbothered. That is what you are building. And it matters far more than any external circumstance that any given day can bring. This is Elite Success Audiobooks, and this is your training, not to be cold, not to be distant, but to be in control of your reactions, of your attention, of your energy, of the one thing that no external force has ever had the right to take from you: the quality of your own inner world. Guard it, build it, return to it every time life does what life does, and watch what becomes possible in a person who is no longer at the mercy of what happens around them, who lives instead from something constructed carefully and deliberately within, something no circumstance can reach, something no opinion can diminish, something no test, no matter how persistent, no matter how unexpected, can finally move. That is the unbothered life, and it is yours to build. The journey you began here does not end when this audiobook does. It continues in every moment you choose response over reaction, composure over chaos, internal authority over external dependency. Every single one of those moments is a vote for the person you are becoming and for the life that person makes possible.